My name is Patricia Coleman, and I'm 64 years old, a retired florist who spent 35 years creating beautiful arrangements for other people's most precious moments, a devoted wife who believed that love could bloom in any season, and a stepmother who thought that patience and kindness could weave even the most fractured family together into something strong and beautiful. 12 years ago, I married George Coleman, a widower whose first wife had passed away after a long battle with breast cancer, leaving him heartbroken and struggling to raise 2 teenage daughters on his own. Lisa was 16 then, angry at the world and fiercely protective of her father's memory of her mother. Karen was 14, confused and hurt by the loss that had shattered her sense of security. I knew that loving them wouldn't be easy, but I believed that with time and patience, we could build something meaningful together. For 12 years, I poured my savings, my heart, my very soul into George's family, believing that love could heal any wound and bridge any gap. When George's florist business began to struggle during the economic downturn, I sold my own successful flower shop and used the proceeds to keep his dream alive, never once asking for recognition or gratitude. When Lisa and Karen needed college funding, I liquidated my retirement accounts without hesitation, believing that their education was an investment in our family's future. When George's elderly mother became ill and needed round-the-clock care, I moved her into our home and nursed her through her final years, sacrificing my own health and peace of mind to ensure she died with dignity, surrounded by love. I gave everything I had to George's family because I believed that marriage meant becoming one unit, that stepchildren could learn to love a woman who chose to love their father, that sacrifice and devotion would create unbreakable bonds between us all. Then George's cancer returned last month, more aggressive than before, and everything I thought I knew about family loyalty crumbled into dust that tasted bitter as poison on my tongue. As my husband lay weak and frightened in his hospital bed, struggling with treatments that left him confused and vulnerable, his daughters saw an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Lisa cornered George during one of his worst days when the chemotherapy had left him disoriented and desperate for any hope of recovery, and convinced him that changing his will was necessary to protect the family's future. Karen joined the campaign with her own manipulation, painting me as a gold digger who'd been waiting years for him to die so I could steal everything his first wife had helped him build. "You're nothing but a leech, Patricia," Lisa snarled when I tried to discuss their pressure on their sick father. "You've been bleeding this family dry for 12 years, and you're not getting a penny more." Karen's words cut even deeper. "You'll get nothing from us. Dad's finally seeing you for what you really are." Standing in that sterile hospital room, watching the daughters I'd helped raise treat me like a criminal, while their father lay dying just feet away, I felt something shatter inside me that I knew would never fully heal. But as I absorbed the magnitude of their betrayal and the cruelty they were inflicting on their own father during his darkest hour, something unexpected began to stir in the deepest part of my soul. What Lisa didn't know, what she'd never bothered to discover in her rush to steal everything I'd helped build, was that George had written me a letter 3 years ago, a legally binding document that affirmed me as his equal heir and explicitly stated his intention to provide for my security after his death. Hidden in my personal safe, that letter would expose their lies about being his true family and reveal the strength I'd forgotten I possessed during 12 years of trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The discovery that George had changed his will without telling me, cutting me out entirely while he was heavily medicated and barely coherent, left me reeling for days as I tried to process the magnitude of what his daughters had convinced him to do. When I finally gathered the courage to confront Lisa about the manipulation and pressure they'd put on their sick father, I found her at George's house, our house, sitting at the kitchen table with Karen and her mother-in-law Maureen, apparently planning some kind of coordinated response to my questions about our family's financial arrangements. The sight of them sitting in the home I'd helped maintain and improve for 12 years, discussing my future as if they had every right to make decisions about property I'd invested in and loved, should have warned me about the scope of their conspiracy. But I was still naive enough to believe that honesty and family history could resolve what I assumed was some kind of misunderstanding driven by grief and fear about George's declining health. Lisa, sweetheart. I said, my voice trembling with the effort of staying calm, despite the devastating evidence I discovered. We need to talk about the will changes your father made while he was on those heavy pain medications. I'm concerned that he wasn't thinking clearly when he signed those documents, and I'm hoping we can work together to ensure his actual wishes are honored. Lisa barely looked up from the legal papers spread across the oak table that George and I had picked out together during our second year of marriage, her expression carrying the kind of cold calculation that suggested she'd been planning this moment for months or even years. When she finally addressed me, her tone was that of someone explaining simple facts to a confused outsider rather than speaking to the woman who'd been her stepmother for over a decade. Patricia, you're obviously confused about your legal status in this family, she said with practiced condescension, sliding a folder of documents toward me across the table. These papers clearly show that Dad has made the decision to leave his estate to his biological children, which is perfectly normal and legal. Perhaps you're having trouble accepting that your marriage doesn't automatically entitle you to inherit property that belongs to our mother's memory. The documents she presented were designed to overwhelm me with legal language and official-looking seals. But what struck me most was the casual way she dismissed 12 years of marriage and partnership as if I'd been nothing more than a temporary house guest who'd overstayed my welcome. But the attack that followed revealed the true scope of their greed and their complete disregard for everything I'd contributed to their family's stability and success. Karen joined the assault with her own carefully rehearsed performance, her voice taking on the righteous indignation of someone who'd convinced herself that stealing was actually justice. The truth is, Patricia, you've been living off our family's generosity for 12 years without contributing anything meaningful to our security or our father's happiness. Now it's time for people who actually belong in this family to make decisions about our inheritance. But it was the demands that followed that revealed their true intentions and the breathtaking scope of their entitlement. With the casual arrogance of people who'd already decided my fate, they informed me that significant changes needed to be made to ensure their financial security and my prompt removal from their lives. This house belongs to our father's legacy and our mother's memory. Lisa announced, gesturing around the home where I'd planted gardens, chosen furniture, and created countless memories of holiday celebrations and family gatherings. We think you should consider moving out immediately while Dad's still alive to see that his wishes are being respected. You can find a small apartment somewhere that's more appropriate for someone in your financial position. Maureen supported their demands with her own twisted logic about family hierarchies and inheritance rights, apparently serving as their unofficial spokesperson for matters they found too awkward to discuss directly. Your savings account should be used to cover George's medical expenses, she announced with the authority of someone who'd already examined my private financial records without permission. Since you've been living in this house rent-free for 12 years, it's only fair that you contribute something substantial to his care costs before you leave. The casual way they discussed stealing my home, my savings, and my place in George's life revealed that this systematic betrayal had been planned long in advance, not the spontaneous response to his illness that they'd presented it as. But I still clung to the desperate hope that somewhere beneath their greed was the family I'd tried so hard to build, the daughters I'd helped raise, who might remember the woman who'd sacrificed her own dreams to support theirs. "Lisa, please," I pleaded, my voice breaking with the weight of 12 years of shared history. "Remember when you were 18 and terrified about starting college? I spent weeks helping you pick classes and find housing because I wanted you to succeed. Remember when Karen had that terrible breakup her sophomore year and cried on my shoulder for hours? I stayed up with her all night, making tea and listening because I loved her like my own daughter. Can't you find some way to remember what we meant to each other?" But my desperate appeal for the bonds we'd once shared was met with even crueler attacks on my character and my right to be treated with basic human dignity. Maureen launched into a systematic destruction of my reputation that revealed months of planning and coordination among George's extended family and social circle. "Patricia's been showing signs of instability for over a year," she announced to Lisa and Karen, as if I weren't sitting right there listening to every poisonous word. "I've been telling people at the garden club about her increasing desperation and her obvious gold-digging behavior. She's been manipulating George's emotions while he's been sick, trying to secure his assets before he dies." Karen joined the character assassination with her own contribution to their campaign of lies, her voice dripping with the kind of manufactured concern that only comes from extensive rehearsal. She's been completely out of touch with reality about her place in this family. She said with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to express her true feelings about me. 12 years of playing house doesn't make someone a real family member, and it certainly doesn't entitle her to steal our inheritance. The lies that followed were so outrageous and cruel, they actually took my breath away, revealing a level of malice I'd never suspected existed beneath their surface politeness during family gatherings. They accused me of exploiting George's wealth, manipulating his medical decisions, and systematically isolating him from his real family during his illness. But the most devastating assault came when they began attacking my professional reputation and my contributions to our community through my years of volunteer work with local charities and church organizations. Patricia's been spreading lies about our family to anyone who'll listen. Lisa announced with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time crafting this narrative. She's been playing the victim while actually being the predator, manipulating sick elderly people and their families for financial gain. As I sat there in my own kitchen, listening to 3 people calmly discuss dismantling my entire life as if I were already dead, I felt the last vestiges of my faith and family love slip away like water through a broken dam. These people weren't my family anymore, despite 12 years of trying to earn their acceptance and love. They were predators who'd been circling for years, waiting for George to become vulnerable enough for them to execute their scheme to steal everything we'd built together. But somewhere in the depths of my devastation, something harder and more dangerous was beginning to emerge. The woman who'd spent 35 years creating beauty from nothing, who'd built a successful business from scratch and supported countless families through their most difficult moments, was starting to remember what real strength looked like when it was tested by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The weeks that followed that devastating confrontation brought a steady escalation of demands and humiliations, that revealed the true scope of their plans for my complete destruction and removal from George's life. Karen called daily with new requirements, each one more degrading than the last, clearly testing to see how much abuse I would tolerate before breaking entirely under the pressure of their coordinated assault on my dignity and independence. Patricia, she announced during one particularly cruel phone call. Lisa and I have been discussing your employment situation, and we think it's time you started contributing meaningfully to Dad's medical expenses instead of just sitting around the house pretending to be his devoted wife. There's a home health care agency that's looking for caregivers, and you could work for other families to earn money for Dad's treatments. The suggestion that I take a job caring for strangers while my own husband battled cancer, leaving him alone during his most vulnerable hours so I could earn money that his daughters would then control, revealed their complete disregard for George's emotional needs and their twisted understanding of my role in his life. But Karen's cruelty was just the beginning of their systematic campaign to strip away every vestige of my security and independence. And we've decided to consolidate Dad's accounts under Lisa's name for easier management. She continued with the casual authority of someone who'd already forged the necessary signatures and completed the transfers. The joint account you've been using for household expenses and medical bills will be closed, and all financial decisions will go through Lisa from now on. It's really much more efficient this way. The realization that they'd locked me out of our family's financial accounts, leaving me unable to pay for George's medications or even basic household expenses, was so shocking that it took several moments for the full implications to sink in. Without access to our joint resources, I couldn't even afford to keep George comfortable during his cancer treatments, making me dependent on his daughter's sporadic generosity for every necessity. But the cruelest revelation was still to come, delivered through a conversation that finally made me understand how completely Lisa had rewritten our family history to justify her systematic theft of everything I'd sacrificed to provide for their welfare and education. "You need to understand, Patricia," she said during a phone call that I'd hoped might lead to some kind of reconciliation, "that you were never really our stepmother. You were just Dad's second wife, someone who happened to move in after our mother died. All those things you did for us, paying for college and helping with family problems, those weren't motherly sacrifices. They were just you trying to buy acceptance from people who never asked for your help." It was during these conversations, as I listened to them calmly discuss destroying everything I'd worked 12 years to build, that the painful truth finally crystallized in my mind with devastating clarity. I wasn't Lisa's stepmother in her eyes, not anymore, maybe not ever. I was a resource to be exploited until I was completely drained, then discarded like a broken appliance that had outlived its usefulness. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every time I'd chosen their needs over my own security and happiness had been cataloged in their minds as evidence of my obligation to continue providing unlimited support rather than recognition of my extraordinary generosity and love. I thought about the day I'd sold my florist shop to keep George's business afloat during the recession, giving up the work I loved and the financial independence I'd spent decades building, because I believed that marriage meant supporting each other through difficult times. I'd had offers to expand my business into wedding planning and large-scale event coordination, dreams of traveling to flower markets in Europe and studying with master florists in Japan, plans for a secure and comfortable retirement funded by the sale of my successful shop. Instead, I'd liquidated everything to save George's struggling business, then spent years helping him rebuild while never once asking for recognition or official partnership in the company I'd essentially funded. When the business finally became profitable again, it was listed entirely in George's name, with no acknowledgement of my financial contribution or ongoing involvement in its success. What I'd hidden from everyone, including George, was how much those early years of financial sacrifice had cost me physically and emotionally. The stress of managing 2 failing businesses while caring for his elderly mother had gradually worn down my health and immune system. The constant worry about our finances and George's emotional state had contributed to the high blood pressure and chronic fatigue that now complicated my daily life and limited my energy for caring for him during his cancer treatments. I'd been slowly destroying my own health and future to provide George's family with stability and security. And when my sacrifices were no longer needed, they'd been forgotten rather than appreciated. Lisa and Karen had built their successful lives on the foundation I'd provided, then convinced themselves that my contributions had been insignificant or even burdensome. When Lisa learned about the true cost of my sacrifice through our current crisis, her reaction revealed the stunning depth of her selfishness and complete inability to accept responsibility for her own success and the opportunities I'd made possible for her. Instead of gratitude or remorse, she offered only blame and resentment, as if I'd somehow forced her to accept my financial support rather than volunteering to help her achieve her educational and professional goals. "You always made everything about you, Patricia," she said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent years rewriting history to avoid feeling obligated to the woman who'd funded her college education. "My success in life has nothing to do with your money. I would have found a way to pay for school myself if you hadn't interfered with your controlling generosity." Karen joined her attack with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased to finally have permission to express the resentment she'd apparently been harboring since the day I'd married her father. "The truth is, Patricia, your so-called sacrifices weren't really about helping our family. They were about feeding your own need to feel important and needed. You couldn't have children of your own, so you bought your way into our family and then spent 12 years making us feel guilty for existing." But the most devastating blow came when Lisa accused me of causing George's cancer relapse through emotional manipulation and stress, claiming that my presence in his life had weakened his immune system and undermined his recovery from his first bout with the disease. "Dad was in remission and doing well until you started pressuring him about estate planning and inheritance rights," she said with the twisted logic of someone determined to blame everyone except the cancer itself for her father's suffering. "Your constant neediness and financial demands have stressed him to the point where his body couldn't fight off the disease anymore." The solutions they proposed for my situation revealed the true scope of their cruelty and their complete disregard for my dignity or well-being during George's final months. Lisa had found what she called the perfect living arrangement for someone in my financial position, a subsidized apartment complex for low-income elderly people on the outskirts of town. The monthly rent would consume most of my Social Security income, leaving me dependent on their occasional charity for medical expenses and basic necessities. "Think of it as starting fresh," Maureen said, with false cheerfulness that didn't mask her obvious pleasure at my anticipated downfall. "You'll be with people in your own economic situation, and George's family will have the space and privacy they need to focus on his recovery without the stress of managing your emotional needs." The paperwork they wanted me to sign would strip away every last vestige of my financial independence and legal standing in George's life. medical decision forms that would remove my authority as his spouse and transfer all healthcare choices to Lisa, property transfer documents that would deed our house to his daughters immediately, rather than waiting for his death, insurance policy changes that would remove me as beneficiary and make his children the sole inheritors of everything we'd built together. As I listened to them outline their plans for my systematic impoverishment and isolation during my husband's final battle with cancer, I felt something inside me die. The trusting, self-sacrificing wife who'd believed that love could create family bonds was taking her last breath. But in that death, something harder and infinitely more dangerous was being born. Something that remembered what it felt like to build a business from nothing, to fight for customers who tried to cheat me, to protect employees from suppliers who would exploit them. They thought they were dealing with a broken old woman who would accept their abuse and disappear quietly into subsidized housing for discarded elderly people. They had no idea they just awakened a retired businesswoman who'd spent 35 years dealing with difficult customers and ruthless competitors, someone who understood exactly how to document fraud and deliver consequences that would echo through generations. The final assault on my dignity and independence came on a Thursday morning in late November, delivered with the kind of calculated precision that suggested weeks of legal consultation and strategic planning. Lisa arrived at my front door at 8 a.m. sharp, accompanied by Karen and a locksmith, who began changing the locks on what had been my home for 12 years, working with the professional efficiency of someone who'd handled many similar family evictions. Patricia Slisa announced without any pretense of stepdaughterly affection or concern for my feelings, "You have 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate this property so we can focus on Dad's care without the distraction of your constant drama and emotional manipulation. The attorney has confirmed that the house belongs to our father's estate, and we have legal authority to determine who's allowed to live here." Karen stepped forward with moving boxes and packing materials, apparently expecting me to immediately begin dismantling 12 years of married life while they supervised my departure. "We'll need to inspect everything you take to make sure it actually belongs to you," she announced with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to exercise complete control over my movements and possessions. The furniture, the artwork, the garden tools, most of that stuff was here when you moved in or was purchased with Dad's money. But the cruelest blow was still to come, delivered through a violation of my privacy that revealed the true scope of their planning and their complete disregard for any boundaries of decency or family loyalty. Maureen had somehow gained access to personal letters I'd written to friends and family members over the years, private correspondence that detailed my struggles to fit into George's family and my hopes for building lasting relationships with his daughters. "We thought you should know," Lisa said with obvious satisfaction at this latest humiliation, "that Maureen has been sharing your letters with us, and they've been quite revealing about your true motivations for marrying our father. Your own words prove that you were targeting a widower for financial security rather than genuinely loving him or caring about his children. The letters Maureen had stolen and twisted were taken completely out of context. Private thoughts about the challenges of stepmotherhood and my concerns about being accepted by George's family transformed into evidence of manipulation and gold-digging behavior. According to their interpretation, my honest discussions about financial sacrifices and my hopes for family unity were actually confessions of calculated predatory behavior. Dear Margaret, Maureen read from one of my letters to my sister. apparently capturing my words on her phone for future use. I know it's been difficult adjusting to George's family situation, but I really believe that love and patience can overcome the girl's resistance to having a stepmother. I've been trying to show them that I'm not trying to replace their mother, just add something positive to their lives. But even as they systematically dismantled my life around me, I held on to one last desperate hope that Lisa retained some small vestige of the teenager I'd helped raise, some fragment of conscience that might be reached through a stepmother's love. I approached her with tears streaming down my face, my voice breaking with the weight of 12 years of shared history. "Lisa," I whispered, using the affectionate tone I'd used when she'd been a frightened teenager afraid of starting college. "Please remember who we used to be to each other. Remember when you graduated and thanked me for believing in you when you didn't believe in yourself. Remember when your grandmother was dying and we took care of her together because you said I was the only person who understood how much she meant to you. Can't you find some way to remember that love?" The silence that greeted my desperate plea was more devastating than any cruel words could have been. Lisa's face remained stone cold as she watched me pour out my heart, clearly unmoved by memories that had once meant everything to both of us. But her response when it came was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "Sign away your inheritance rights, Patricia, or we'll destroy your reputation so completely that no one in this town will ever speak to you again," she said with the calculated cruelty of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "We have enough evidence of your manipulative behavior to convince everyone that you're a predator who targeted our father for his money." But I wasn't content to let my destruction proceed without revealing the truth that would change everything. As Karen began spray painting "thief" across my beloved garden gate, destroying the entrance to the space where I'd grown flowers for 12 years, something inside me snapped like a wire, stretched beyond its breaking point. "You want to know what kind of stepmother I really am, Lisa," I said, my voice rising until it filled the morning air like thunder rolling across a summer sky. "You want to understand exactly what you're throwing away in your greed and selfishness. Let me tell you about a letter your father wrote me 3 years ago, a letter that proves everything you've been saying about my place in this family is a lie." The morning went silent, except for the sound of Maureen's phone ringing, apparently receiving a call that she answered on speaker, without realizing what she was about to broadcast to whoever was listening. 3 years ago, when your father was worried about his health and wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of, if something happened to him, he wrote me a letter that legally affirms me as his equal heir and explicitly states his intention to provide for my security after his death. I continued needing Lisa to understand the full scope of what her cruelty was destroying. That letter documents his love for me and his gratitude for everything I've sacrificed for his family. I said, my voice steady now, with the calm that comes from finally speaking a truth that's been locked away too long. It also documents his concerns about your financial irresponsibility and his fear that you'd try to steal from me if he died first. My voice cracked with the weight of memories I'd treasured for years, but I forced myself to continue. He wrote that letter because he was afraid you'd do exactly what you're doing now. Manipulate him when he was sick and vulnerable, pressure him to change his will, and try to steal everything we built together. He wanted to make sure I had legal protection from your greed. The devastation on Lisa's face was complete and absolute, but I wasn't finished exposing the magnitude of the love and protection George had tried to provide for me. That letter is notarized, witnessed, and stored in my personal safe where you can't steal it or destroy it. I continued watching her realize that her scheme to disinherit me was about to crumble. It overrides any changes he made while he was on heavy medication and not thinking clearly. Your father protected me from you, Lisa, because he knew exactly what kind of person you really are. As the full weight of my revelation settled over the morning air, I realized that Maureen's phone call was still connected, and whoever was on the other end had heard every word of my disclosure about George's letter and his true intentions for his estate. Lisa's eyes went wide with terror as she realized that her inheritance scheme was no longer secret, that her manipulation of a sick man was now documented and witnessed. The woman who'd spent 12 years trying to earn Lisa's love was finally ready to let the world see exactly who the real predator in our family was. And she was more than capable of using George's own words to teach his daughter the most expensive lesson of her miserable, ungrateful life. The silence that followed my revelation about George's letter stretched like a taut wire between us, heavy with the weight of 3 years of hidden truth finally exposed to the harsh light of day. Lisa stood frozen on my front porch, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Shock, recognition, terror, and something that might have been genuine fear if she'd been capable of such honest feeling about the consequences of her own manipulative behavior. Maureen's phone call was still connected, and I could hear muffled voices on the other end discussing what they'd just heard. Apparently Lisa's legal contacts or financial advisors who now knew about George's letter protecting my inheritance rights. The implications of that accidental broadcast would follow her for months, destroying her plans to steal my share of the estate and exposing her manipulation of a dying man to people whose respect she needed for her schemes to succeed. But I was beyond caring about their emotional states or their increasingly desperate attempts to process the magnitude of what I just revealed. The broken, pleading stepmother they'd been systematically destroying was gone forever, replaced by someone who'd finally remembered her own strength and worth after 12 years of defining herself through their needs and demands. "I'm done, Lisa," I said, my voice carrying the calm finality of someone who'd finally reached the end of a very long, very painful road. "I'm done being your victim, your scapegoat, your convenient source of money and emotional support. I'm done protecting you from the consequences of choices you made as an adult woman who knew exactly what she was doing when she manipulated her dying father." I walked to my car and retrieved the spare key to my personal safe, holding it up so Lisa could see the physical proof that George's letter was safely stored beyond her reach or control. The small silver key represented not just evidence of her manipulation, but my liberation from 12 years of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of genuine gratitude or affection. "You want to know what real consequences look like, Lisa?" I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word as decades of suppressed anger finally found their voice. "You're about to face the truth about what kind of person you really are, what kind of daughter you've always been underneath all your father's protection and my enabling. I'm not your victim anymore, Lisa. I'm the woman who's going to make sure you understand the price of betraying someone who loved you unconditionally." The crash that came from Karen's direction told me she'd dropped the spray paint can in shock, probably realizing for the first time that their scheme to disinherit me was built on manipulation of a vulnerable man whose own words would destroy their claims about his true wishes. When Lisa finally found her voice, it carried all the desperate rage of someone whose carefully constructed inheritance scheme was collapsing in real time, someone who'd built her financial future on the assumption that she could steal from a grieving widow without consequences. "You're bluffing," she screamed, her voice cracking with panic and fury. "You wouldn't dare challenge our father's will. You've spent 12 years being grateful for whatever scraps this family through you, and you're not going to grow a backbone now because you're angry about some property arrangements." But Karen's response revealed the depths of their delusion about my character and capabilities, their complete inability to recognize that the woman they'd been abusing possessed both the evidence and the determination to destroy their inheritance plans completely. "She's obviously having some kind of mental breakdown," she announced to Lisa, as if I weren't standing right there holding the key to my husband's true intentions. "The stress of Dad's illness has clearly affected her judgment. Nobody's going to believe her claims about some mysterious letter that nobody's ever seen." Maureen joined their desperate damage control with her own contribution to their rapidly crumbling facade. "Patricia's clearly confused and making things up because she's upset about losing her comfortable lifestyle. These wild claims about secret documents are just her way of trying to get revenge for being excluded from the inheritance she was never entitled to receive. Their attempts to gaslight me into believing I was mentally incompetent were so transparent and pathetic that I actually smiled, an expression that clearly startled them, since they'd probably expected tears and pleading rather than the calm confidence of someone who held all the real power in our relationship. But I was beyond engaging with their manipulative tactics or their increasingly frantic attempts to maintain control over a narrative that was no longer theirs to dictate. I had preparations to make legal strategies to develop George's letter to authenticate and present to probate court. For the first time in months, I had a purpose beyond mere survival, a mission that would require all the skills I'd developed during 35 years of running a successful business and dealing with difficult customers. I stopped answering Lisa's increasingly desperate phone calls, stopped responding to Karen's threatening emails, stopped engaging with any of their attempts to manipulate me back into the role of grateful victim. Instead, I focused on the practical steps necessary to reclaim my independence and protect George's true wishes from their systematic theft. The memoir writing class at the community center had always appealed to me, but I'd never had time to attend while caring for George and managing our household. Now, as I sat in that circle of elderly writers sharing their life stories, I discovered something precious I'd been missing for years, a community of people who understood the value of preserving truth and the importance of bearing witness to both love and betrayal. When I shared excerpts from my own story, the sacrifice, the manipulation, the discovery of George's protective letter, the response was immediate and powerful. Several class members had similar experiences of family financial abuse, and their support gave me strength I hadn't felt since before George's illness began. The note I left for Lisa 3 days later was brief, precise, and completely devoid of the step-maternal warmth that had characterized our relationship for 12 years. I outlined exactly what evidence I possessed, what legal actions I was prepared to take, and what her inheritance would look like when George's true wishes were honored in probate court. "Your lies will unravel, Lisa," I wrote in my careful handwriting. "And when they do, you'll understand what it means to face someone who refused to be broken by your cruelty. You chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty, theft over family loyalty. Now you can live with the consequences of those choices without any protection from me." I mailed the note certified delivery, ensuring that Lisa would have to sign for it personally and acknowledge that she'd received my final communication as her stepmother. Then I blocked her number, deleted her email address from my contacts, and began the process of building a life that had no room for people who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as stupidity. But Lisa and her accomplices weren't prepared to surrender without a fight, and their counterattack came with all the desperation of people who'd suddenly realized they were facing genuine legal consequences for their manipulation of a dying man. Lisa began calling my former florist suppliers and church members, spreading rumors that I was suffering from advanced dementia and had been making wild accusations against family members who were trying to help me manage my declining mental capacity. Patricia's completely lost touch with reality. She told anyone who would listen, apparently believing that destroying my professional reputation would somehow neutralize the evidence I held of George's true intentions. She's been displaying signs of paranoid delusions for months, accusing innocent family members of stealing from her when they're actually trying to protect her from making dangerous financial decisions. Karen escalated her social media campaign with increasingly vicious posts that accused me of theft, fraud, and elder abuse against my own husband. According to her fabricated narrative, I'd been manipulating George's medications to keep him confused, stealing from his accounts while he was incapacitated, and forging documents to support my claims about his wishes. Patricia Coleman has finally shown her true colors. Karen posted with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to express her manufactured resentment. She's been playing the victim while actually being the predator, manipulating a sick man, and then crying abuse when his real family tried to protect him from her financial exploitation. But their lies and threats no longer had the power to wound me. I'd discovered something precious in the ashes of our destroyed relationship. The liberating knowledge that I didn't need their approval, their love, or their presence in my life to be happy and fulfilled. The woman who'd spent 12 years defining herself as George's devoted stepmother was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to be valued for her own worth rather than her usefulness to ungrateful relatives. For the first time since George's diagnosis, I felt genuinely excited about the future I was building with my own hands and my own choices. The Thursday evening memoir class at the community center had become my sanctuary during the turbulent weeks following my break with Lisa's toxic manipulation, a place where my story was met with understanding rather than judgment, where my pain was validated rather than dismissed as the confusion of a grieving wife. When I shared the full details of George's letter and the systematic abuse I'd endured from his daughters, the response from my fellow writers was both immediate and transformative. Patricia, said Ellen Martinez, a retired family law attorney who joined our class after her own experience with inheritance fraud, what you've described isn't just family conflict. It's systematic elder financial abuse combined with manipulation of a vulnerable cancer patient. I'd like to help you challenge their will changes and ensure your husband's true wishes are honored in probate court. Ellen's offer to provide legal assistance pro bono felt like a gift from the universe, a chance to transform my personal pain into genuine justice rather than simply accepting my losses and trying to rebuild from nothing. Within a week, she'd reviewed George's letter, analyzed the will changes made during his illness, and confirmed that his daughter's manipulation could be challenged successfully with the right legal strategy and presentation of evidence. The beauty of this case, Ellen explained as we sat in her modest office reviewing years of financial documentation, is that your husband was remarkably clear about his intentions and his concerns about his daughter's financial responsibility. His letter provides exactly the kind of evidence that probate courts need to see when family members challenge inappropriate will changes. But Ellen offered me something even more valuable than legal representation. She connected me with the Community Garden Alliance, a volunteer organization dedicated to creating green spaces that brought elderly residents together while providing fresh food for families facing financial hardship. When the Alliance's coordinator learned about my background as a florist and my current situation, she offered me an opportunity that would change the trajectory of my new life. "Patricia," said Margaret Foster, a woman whose own experience with family betrayal had motivated her to create programs that supported isolated elderly residents. "We've been looking for someone with your horticultural expertise to coordinate our newest project. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to help us establish a memorial garden that honors community members who've overcome family adversity." The opportunity to transform my professional skills into community leadership felt like discovering my true calling after years of defining myself solely through family relationships and other people's needs. Within a month, I was coordinating the Alliance's Gardens of Resilience project, organizing workshops for elderly residents and their supporters about healing through nature and finding strength in community connections. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply fulfilling, connecting me with dozens of people who'd survived experiences similar to mine and were eager to help create something beautiful from their pain. For the first time since marrying George, I felt like I was part of a community that valued my contributions rather than simply tolerating my presence for what I could provide financially. The Alliance's annual fundraising event was held on a crisp Saturday evening in December, bringing together local philanthropists, government officials, and community leaders who supported our mission of creating healing spaces for elderly residents recovering from family trauma and financial abuse. As the coordinator of our Memorial Garden project, I'd been invited to present our work and request funding for expanded programs that would serve other communities facing similar challenges. I was reviewing my presentation materials backstage when I spotted a familiar figure near the donor reception area, and my heart sank with the recognition of trouble approaching like storm clouds on an otherwise perfect evening. Maureen stood among a group of well-dressed community volunteers wearing an expensive evening dress and clearly working to position herself as someone with influence and insider knowledge about charitable work and community service. Our eyes met across the crowded reception hall, and I saw the same predatory gleam that had driven her attacks on my character and her theft of my private correspondence. She approached with the confident stride of someone who believed she still held the power to humiliate and destroy me, apparently convinced that my new role with the Garden Alliance was just another manifestation of my supposed desperation rather than evidence of my professional competence and community value. "Well, well," she said loudly enough for nearby donors and board members to hear, "if it isn't Patricia Coleman. How absolutely surprising to see you here. I had no idea that people who make false accusations against their own families were welcome at respectable charitable organizations." The calculated cruelty of her words was designed to immediately establish me as someone of questionable character in front of people whose respect and support I needed for our garden project. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably clearly, unsure how to process this unexpected personal attack in what should have been a positive, collaborative environment focused on supporting community healing programs. I suppose desperate people will try anything to rehabilitate their reputations after destroying family relationships with lies and manipulation. Maureen continued, warming to her theme with obvious pleasure. "But really, Patricia, don't you think it's a bit pathetic for a desperate widow to pretend she understands complex community development issues? These good people should know what kind of person they're really dealing with." She gestured dismissively at my simple black dress and modest jewelry, clearly intending to highlight the contrast with her own expensive appearance and what she assumed was my diminished social status after being disinherited by George's daughters. I mean, look at her. Does this look like someone who has the credibility or resources to advise others about garden design and community leadership? She's obviously here, looking for handouts and sympathy, not offering genuine expertise to people who need real help. The murmur that rippled through our small audience was uncomfortable and uncertain, exactly the reaction Maureen had been hoping to provoke. Some faces showed confusion about this unexpected personal drama, while others reflected the kind of doubt that comes from hearing accusations from someone who presented herself as having insider knowledge about family situations and community affairs. But I'd spent 35 years handling difficult situations in front of customers far more challenging than this group of well-intentioned community leaders. I waited for Maureen to finish her character assassination, letting her expose the full extent of her malice and desperation before responding with the calm authority that had served me well in countless business presentations and customer conferences. When my turn came to address the gathering, I approached the podium with a confidence born from knowing that authentic experience resonated more deeply than superficial appearances, that truth was more powerful than manipulation when presented with clarity and professional competence. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. I want to share with you a story that illustrates exactly why the Garden Alliance's healing programs are so desperately needed in communities like ours. It's the story of a 64-year-old woman who discovered that creating beauty from pain isn't just possible, it's essential for survival when the people you've loved most try to destroy everything you've built together. Instead of defending myself against Maureen's accusations, I simply told my story, sharing the real facts about family financial abuse, the systematic theft that elderly spouses faced when their children viewed inheritance as more important than honoring their parents' wishes, and the importance of community support in helping victims rebuild their lives and find new purpose. When I finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause that lasted for several minutes. Margaret Foster approached the podium with obvious pride and excitement, announcing that our Memorial Garden project had just received a $30,000 matching grant from the State Arts Council to expand our healing programs throughout the county. Patricia's courage in sharing her story and her expertise in creating therapeutic garden spaces, Margaret announced to the assembled crowd, represents exactly the kind of authentic leadership that transforms communities and helps people heal from their deepest wounds. As I watched Maureen's face cycle through shock recognition and finally a kind of desperate humiliation, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from justice finally being served through competence and community recognition rather than manipulation and character assassination. My new role as coordinator of the Garden Alliance's Memorial Project came with unexpected benefits beyond the satisfaction of meaningful work and community recognition. It also provided me with access to resources and legal expertise that would prove invaluable in exposing the true extent of Maureen's lies and the systematic way she'd been attacking vulnerable elderly people throughout our community to protect Lisa's inheritance scheme. When I mentioned to Ellen that I was concerned about Maureen's pattern of spreading false information about elderly residents who'd accessed legal help for family financial disputes, Ellen's response revealed that my suspicions were well-founded and potentially actionable under state harassment and defamation laws. Patricia, she said with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades building legal cases against people who exploited vulnerable populations. I've been researching Mrs. Patterson's recent activities and her connections to other inheritance disputes in our community. I think you should see what I've discovered about her systematic campaign to discredit elderly residents who've challenged questionable will changes. What Ellen had uncovered was a pattern of malicious behavior that went far beyond Maureen's theft of my personal letters and her attacks on my character. She'd been systematically targeting elderly community members who'd sought legal assistance for family financial abuse, spreading rumors about their mental capacity and family relationships whenever they achieved any kind of legal success that might encourage other elderly victims to seek help. This is witness intimidation disguised as community concern, Ellen explained as she spread documented evidence across my kitchen table. She identifies vulnerable elderly people who are fighting family financial exploitation, then spreads rumors designed to destroy their credibility and discourage others from seeking legal help when their children are stealing from them. The evidence Ellen had gathered painted a picture of a woman whose loyalty to Lisa had driven her to destroy the lives of multiple elderly community members over the past 18 months. Her pattern was consistent: identify vulnerable elderly people who were challenging inappropriate will. Changes then spread carefully crafted lies designed to isolate them from sources of legal help and community support. The monthly meeting of our town's Community Development Council provided the perfect opportunity to share this information with people who had both the authority and moral obligation to act on it. As I presented our findings to the council members, I watched their faces change from polite interest to genuine horror as they absorbed the scope of Maureen's systematic attack on elderly residents who'd sought legal protection from family abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, standing to address the room with the same confidence I'd once used to present business proposals to demanding customers, our community's support systems for elderly residents are being undermined by people who use social connections and false information to discourage vulnerable citizens from seeking legal help when their families are stealing from them. I distributed copies of Ellen's research to each council member, along with witness statements from elderly community members who'd been targeted by Maureen's campaign of lies and character assassination. Margaret Foster, who served on both our Garden Alliance board and the county's Elder Services Advisory Committee, was particularly disturbed by the evidence of Maureen's systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly people. This is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys community trust and prevents elderly residents from accessing the legal protections they need and deserve. She said, her voice tight with controlled anger. If these allegations are accurate, Mrs. Patterson has been using her social connections as weapons against some of our most vulnerable community members. But Maureen wasn't content to let her exposure proceed without attempting to fight back, and her counterattack came at our next council meeting with all the desperation of someone whose entire social identity was crumbling under legal scrutiny. Standing before an audience of community leaders and local media representatives, she launched into a character assassination that revealed the true depths of her malice and her complete inability to accept responsibility for her own destructive behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced with the theatrical authority of someone accustomed to manipulating public opinion through false sympathy. Before we continue with tonight's agenda, I feel obligated as a concerned community member to share some serious concerns about Patricia Coleman and her increasingly disturbing campaign of false accusations against innocent families who've tried to help elderly residents manage their affairs responsibly. Her voice rose with each accusation, taking on the shrill quality of someone who knows they're losing but refuses to surrender gracefully. Mrs. Coleman has been systematically targeting successful community members with fabricated stories of harassment and defamation, apparently as revenge for her own family's decision to help her understand her actual legal status after her husband's death. The audience shifted uncomfortably as Maureen's tirade continued, clearly disturbed by both the severity of her accusations and the increasingly erratic nature of her presentation. But I remained perfectly calm, having anticipated exactly this kind of desperate response from someone whose pattern of harassment had been exposed to community scrutiny. When Maureen finally paused for breath, I stood slowly and approached the council podium with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent decades managing hostile confrontations with difficult customers and their advocates. From my briefcase, I withdrew a small recording device that Ellen and I had prepared specifically for this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent meeting room, Mrs. Patterson's accusations deserve a response based on facts rather than emotions. I'd like to share some audio documentation that addresses her concerns about my credibility and motivations. The recording I played was Maureen's own voice, captured during a voicemail she'd left for Lisa 2 weeks earlier when she thought she was speaking confidentially to her ally in their campaign against me. In her own words, Maureen detailed her strategy for destroying my reputation through stolen correspondence, her plans for discrediting other elderly residents who sought legal help, and her complete fabrication of stories about my supposed financial desperation. Lisa, we need to coordinate our efforts to discredit Patricia, and anyone else who might encourage elderly people to challenge Will changes. Maureen's voice filled the meeting room with devastating clarity. I've been telling people that she's showing signs of dementia and making wild accusations against your family. If we can get enough people spreading the same stories, we can isolate her completely and discourage other elderly residents from seeking legal help when their children are managing their estates. The reaction was immediate and absolute. Several council members began expressing their outrage at the systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly residents, while others called for law enforcement investigation into what appeared to be organized harassment of people seeking legal assistance. The local newspaper reporter was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that this was front-page news about a scandal affecting multiple families. Ellen stepped forward with additional evidence we'd gathered from other elderly residents who'd been targeted by Maureen's harassment campaign, including documented proof of her coordination with families who were stealing from elderly relatives and her systematic efforts to prevent victims from accessing legal resources. This pattern of behavior, Ellen announced, represents a clear violation of our community's values and potentially criminal witness intimidation under state law. Mrs. Patterson has been using her social connections to harm people who couldn't defend themselves from coordinated attacks. The council voted unanimously to ban Maureen from all community volunteer positions and to request a full investigation by law enforcement and elder protection services. Local organizations began distancing themselves from her, immediately clearly recognizing that association with her harassment campaign would destroy their own credibility and effectiveness. As Maureen fled the meeting room in obvious shame and defeat, Ellen approached with legal papers already prepared for exactly this moment. Mrs. Patterson She called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You're being served with papers in the matter of Coleman versus Patterson, a civil lawsuit for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and systematic harassment of elderly community members." The papers scattered to the floor as Maureen stumbled toward the exit, her social standing and community influence destroyed as thoroughly as she'd once tried to destroy mine and other elderly residents who'd sought legal protection from family abuse. As I watched her retreat, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from justice finally being served through legal action and community accountability. The retired florist who'd spent her career creating beauty for others had just delivered the most important presentation of her lifetime. The phone call came exactly 48 hours after Maureen's public humiliation and banishment from our community's volunteer organizations at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning when I was preparing soil amendments for our Memorial Gardens spring planting season. I'd been expecting it, of course. The destruction of her allies' social standing and the exposure of their coordinated harassment campaign had undoubtedly sent Lisa into the kind of panic that makes desperate people attempt even more desperate measures to salvage what remained of their crumbling inheritance scheme. I let the phone ring 5 times before answering, taking a moment to center myself and prepare for what I knew would be either a final attempt at manipulation or a last-ditch effort to somehow transform their criminal exposure into my responsibility for their downfall. When I finally picked up the receiver, Lisa's voice exploded through the connection with all the rage and fear I'd anticipated. "What the hell have you done?" she screamed, abandoning any pretense of stepdaughterly affection or civilized discourse. "Maureen's been banned from every organization in town. People are asking questions about our family situation because of your vindictive campaign against innocent people who were trying to help you understand your legal position." Her voice cracked with the strain of someone whose carefully constructed support network was collapsing faster than she could comprehend the full scope of her legal and social exposure. But I felt no sympathy for her distress. This was exactly the kind of consequence I'd been hoping to deliver when I'd first decided to stop protecting her from the truth about her own manipulative behavior and character. "Lisa," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled into chaos through her own greed and manipulation. "I haven't fabricated any evidence against you or Maureen. Every piece of information that's come to light consists of documented facts about your actual behavior and her systematic harassment of elderly community members, not accusations I invented to damage your reputations." I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line, clearly struggling to process the reality that her victims had turned out to be far more capable and resourceful than she'd anticipated when she'd started her scheme to manipulate her dying father and steal my inheritance. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from rage to the kind of desperate pleading that comes from someone who's finally realized the full scope of their miscalculation and the genuine legal consequences they were now facing. "Patricia, please, you have to understand that none of this was meant to hurt you personally," she said, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to somehow undo the damage her manipulation had created. "The will changes we helped Dad make were just practical decisions about family assets during his illness. We thought you didn't understand the legal complexities of estate planning, and we wanted to help ensure the family's financial security during a difficult time." The lies poured from her mouth with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent months convincing herself that theft was actually helping, that manipulation was really protection, that systematic elder abuse was somehow justified by her imaginary concern for family welfare and financial responsibility. You have to drop these legal actions against Maureen. She continued, her voice taking on the wheedling quality of someone trying to negotiate from a position of complete powerlessness. Think about what this scandal is doing to our entire family's reputation in the community. Think about Dad's memory and how this public drama is affecting the way people remember him and his legacy. But the most pathetic part of her plea was still to come, delivered with the transparent desperation of someone who'd finally realized that their inheritance scheme had left them facing genuine consequences that couldn't be manipulated away through family guilt or emotional blackmail. "Look, maybe we can work something out between us," she said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper of someone proposing a deal she knew was inappropriate and probably illegal. "Maybe there's a way we can resolve this privately without involving lawyers and community organizations and all this public embarrassment. I know you've been living modestly since we clarified your legal position, and I'm sure there's room for us to discuss some kind of financial arrangement that would benefit everyone involved." The audacity of her suggestion actually made me laugh out loud, a sound that clearly startled her since she'd probably expected tears or anger rather than genuine amusement at her pathetic attempt to bribe her way out of the legal consequences of manipulating a dying man. "Are you seriously trying to buy my silence about your manipulation of your dying father, Lisa?" I asked, still chuckling at the absurdity of someone who'd spent months calling me a gold digger, now attempting to offer me money in exchange for covering up her elder abuse. "After everything you've done, after all the accusations you've made about my character and motivations, you think I can be purchased like some kind of commodity in your inheritance scheme?" The silence that followed was profound and telling the sound of someone finally realizing that they'd completely misjudged both their opponent and their own position in the legal proceedings they'd set in motion through their own greed and cruelty. When Lisa spoke again, her voice carried the hollow desperation of someone making their final appeal before accepting total defeat and the legal consequences that awaited her. "Patricia, I'm begging you," she said, and for the first time in our entire relationship, she actually sounded like she meant it, rather than simply performing emotions she thought might manipulate me into compliance. "Maureen's threatening to expose everything if I don't protect her from these legal charges. Karen's talking about distancing herself from the family if this investigation gets any worse. The probate attorney says Dad's letter might actually override the will changes we helped him make." She paused, clearly expecting some expression of sympathy or concern for her self-inflicted suffering. But I remained silent, waiting for her to continue digging her own legal grave with her words. "We could start over," she continued desperately, "all of us together as a real family. You could come back to live in the house, and we could put all this misunderstanding behind us. I could take care of you during your grief, make sure you have everything you need for your health and comfort. We could honor Dad's memory by working together instead of fighting in public." The word family, coming from her mouth, was so obscene after everything she'd done that it actually made me feel physically ill. This was the same woman who'd called me a leech and a gold digger, who'd manipulated her dying father to steal my inheritance, who'd conspired with others to destroy my reputation and isolate me from community support. "Lisa," I said, my voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence that would never be appealed or overturned. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. You are no daughter of mine. You stopped being my stepdaughter the moment you chose greed over 12 years of unconditional love and sacrifice. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who'd been struck by a truth they weren't prepared to face. But I wasn't finished delivering the consequences her actions had earned. You chose to manipulate your dying father instead of honoring him. You chose to steal from me instead of respecting me. You chose cruelty over gratitude, exploitation over love theft, over family loyalty. Every decision you've made regarding our relationship has revealed exactly what kind of person you really are, and I want nothing more to do with that person. My voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally learned to protect herself from those who would destroy her for their own benefit. I'm blocking your number when this call ends, and if you attempt to contact me again, through any means, Ellen will have you arrested for harassment and witness intimidation. We are done, Lisa, permanently and completely done. The last sound I heard before hanging up was something that might have been a sob or might have been a curse, but I felt no curiosity about which it was. I immediately blocked her number and called Ellen to have her notify law enforcement about Lisa's attempt to bribe me into dropping legal actions against her accomplices. As I set the phone down and returned to my garden preparation work, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me like warm sunshine on a perfect spring morning. The last tie to my old life of manipulation and abuse had been severed, and I was finally completely free to build something meaningful and valuable with the years I had remaining. Outside my window, the memorial garden site was showing the first signs of spring growth, tender shoots pushing through the soil where we'd planted bulbs donated by community members who'd survived their own family betrayals. Like me, those plants had survived a harsh winter and were now preparing to bloom with renewed strength and purpose. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, and for the first time since George's diagnosis, I found myself genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. The monthly town meeting was meant to be a celebration of our community's progress in supporting elderly residents through our Gardens of Resilience project, a chance for me to present our achievements in creating healing spaces for people recovering from family trauma and financial abuse. As the coordinator of our Memorial Garden initiative, I'd been invited to address the packed auditorium about our work and request additional municipal funding for expanded programs that would serve neighboring communities facing similar challenges. The municipal building's conference room was filled with city council members, local business leaders, social service directors, and elderly residents who understood that healing from family betrayal required community support and meaningful work. I felt a deep sense of pride as I looked out at the assembled crowd, knowing that our garden project had fundamentally changed how our community approached elder trauma and family financial abuse. I was reviewing my presentation notes backstage when I heard the unmistakable sound of aggressive voices and disruptive movement in the main auditorium. Through the curtain, I spotted a familiar figure making her way toward the front row with the kind of determined energy that suggested trouble was about to unfold during my moment of professional recognition and community leadership. Karen had arrived uninvited and clearly unprepared for a respectful community discussion about supporting elderly residents. Her appearance was disheveled. Her clothing suggested someone who'd been under significant stress, and her behavior indicated she was either emotionally unstable or preparing to make some kind of desperate public scene. She positioned herself prominently where she could be seen and heard by everyone in attendance, clearly planning to disrupt my presentation with a calculated attack designed to destroy my credibility before I could expose more of their family's criminal behavior. The sight of her sitting there like a legitimate community member rather than the criminal accomplice she actually was made my stomach clench with anxiety, but I forced myself to remain calm and focused. Whatever she was planning, I had Ellen beside me and a room full of people who'd already witnessed evidence of my competence and integrity through months of successful community leadership and advocacy work. When my turn came to speak, I approached the podium with the confidence that comes from knowing your accomplishments are genuine and your cause serves the most vulnerable members of society. But before I could begin my prepared remarks about our garden project's impact on helping elderly residents heal from family trauma, Karen stood up and began her assault with the theatrical authority of someone who'd spent considerable time planning this moment of disruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who'd been rehearsing this performance for weeks. Before Patricia Coleman begins her presentation, I feel obligated as her family member to share some critical information about her credibility and the real motivation behind her so-called community work that's been tearing families apart with lies and false accusations. The room went silent, with the uncomfortable tension that comes from witnessing an unexpected family confrontation in what should have been a professional community meeting about supporting vulnerable elderly residents. But Karen pressed forward with obvious satisfaction at having captured everyone's attention during what was supposed to be my moment of recognition and respect. "My name is Karen Thompson, and Patricia was my stepmother." She continued pulling out her phone to begin live streaming our confrontation to her social media followers, apparently planning to use the footage for some kind of viral campaign against me. What she hasn't told you, what she's carefully hidden from this community, is that she's been systematically destroying families through fabricated evidence and forged documents designed to steal inheritances from grieving children who were trying to honor their father's memory. The lies poured from her mouth with the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent months crafting this narrative and convincing herself it was somehow justified by their legal troubles. She claimed that I'd forged George's letter to support my inheritance claims, that I'd manipulated a dying man's emotions to gain access to assets that belonged to his biological children, that my community work was actually an elaborate scheme to exploit elderly residents' fears for my own financial benefit and psychological gratification. Patricia Coleman has been playing the victim while actually being the predator, Karen declared with venomous satisfaction, her phone camera capturing every moment of what she clearly expected would be my public destruction and professional humiliation. She forged legal documents to steal from my dying father, then used our family's private tragedy to gain sympathy and donations from people who don't know the truth about her manipulative behavior. Her voice rose with each accusation, taking on the aggressive quality of someone performing for a social media audience, rather than addressing a community meeting about protecting elderly residents from exactly the kind of exploitation she was attempting to perpetrate against me in real time. The so-called letter she claims our father wrote is a complete fabrication. Karen continued her recorded live stream, apparently attracting viewers who were sharing her content across multiple social media platforms. She's been using forged documents and emotional manipulation to convince vulnerable elderly people that their families are stealing from them, then exploiting their fear and confusion to gain control over their financial decisions and legal processes. But Karen's most devastating attack was her systematic destruction of my character through carefully crafted lies designed to make the audience question everything they thought they knew about my work, my motivations, and my relationship with George during his final illness. My stepmother abandoned our family when my father needed her most. Karen continued her live stream, apparently attracting hundreds of viewers who were sharing her content and adding their own commentary about inheritance disputes and family obligations. She refused to provide proper care during his cancer treatments, then made false accusations about our efforts to protect him when we tried to ensure he received the medical attention he deserved. The murmur that rippled through the audience was like a physical blow, the sound of doubt and suspicion spreading through a room that had been filled with respect and support just moments before. I watched faces that had been friendly and admiring shift into expressions of uncertainty and concern, clearly struggling to reconcile the accusations they were hearing with the professional presentation they'd been expecting from someone they trusted to help heal their community's most vulnerable residents. Several city council members began whispering among themselves, obviously troubled by questions about being associated with someone who might be criminally fraudulent in her community work. The local newspaper reporter was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing that family accusations against a community leader would make compelling front-page news regardless of their accuracy or the underlying criminal behavior that had motivated them. Karen's social media followers were apparently sharing her live stream in real time because I could see people in the audience checking their phones and then looking at me with expressions of growing doubt and suspicion about my competence and credibility. The viral nature of her attack was amplifying its impact far beyond the people physically present in the auditorium. The evidence she's presented against my sister and our family, Karen continued building toward her crescendo with obvious pleasure at the chaos she was creating, consists of fabricated documents and manipulated testimony designed to frame innocent family members who were trying to protect a vulnerable elderly man from a predatory second wife who saw him as nothing more than a source of financial security. As I stood there absorbing this calculated assault on my reputation and life's work, I felt the familiar weight of public judgment and social condemnation that had nearly destroyed me months earlier. These were people whose respect I'd earned through months of genuine community service, and now they were looking at me like I might be the very kind of predator they'd gathered to protect their community from. But something remarkable happened as I watched Karen deliver her character assassination with such obvious desperation and social media manipulation designed to intimidate me into silence. Instead of the crushing humiliation and panic she clearly expected to provoke, I felt an almost supernatural calm descend over me like armor, forged from months of surviving her family's systematic abuse and learning to recognize manipulation tactics when they were being used against me. This was exactly what Ellen and I had prepared for the final desperate gambit of a criminal conspiracy that was crumbling under legal investigation and community scrutiny. Karen had just provided the perfect stage for her own complete and final destruction, and she had no idea what kind of evidence I was prepared to present to this room full of officials and community leaders who had the power to protect elderly residents from exactly her kind of predatory behavior. I remained perfectly composed as she finished her tirade, letting her desperation and criminal intent expose themselves to everyone present. When she finally paused to check her phone for social media reactions and apparent viewer counts, I approached the microphone with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades managing crisis situations with professionalism and grace under pressure. "Thank you, Karen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent auditorium, "for providing such a perfect example of exactly the kind of family manipulation and elder abuse that our Gardens of Resilience project exists to help elderly residents heal from and overcome. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate as people realized they were about to witness something far more dramatic and revealing than a routine funding presentation. Ellen approached the podium with our carefully prepared evidence, and I knew that Karen Thompson was about to receive the education of her lifetime about the consequences of attempting to intimidate elderly abuse victims in front of community leaders and law enforcement officials. The silence in the municipal auditorium was so profound, I could hear the old building's heating system cycling in the background and the soft rustle of papers as Ellen approached the podium with our carefully prepared evidence. Karen stood frozen near the front row, her phone still recording what she clearly expected would be my complete breakdown and professional destruction, but finding instead a woman who looked at her with something approaching pity for the legal trap she'd just walked into with her public harassment attempt. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent 35 years building a successful business and dealing with difficult customers who tried to cheat or manipulate me. Karen has just provided you with a perfect demonstration of the kind of elder abuse and witness intimidation that makes family financial exploitation so difficult to prosecute and so devastating to elderly victims who try to seek justice through legal channels. Ellen stepped forward with the first piece of evidence we'd prepared for exactly this confrontation. George's original letter, professionally authenticated by 3 independent handwriting experts and legally certified by the probate court as a valid testamentary document that superseded any will changes made during his illness. The letter represented not just proof of his true intentions, but documentation of his love for me and his concerns about his daughter's financial irresponsibility. This is George Coleman's authentic letter. I announced, holding up the document, that had been verified by multiple experts and accepted by the probate court, written in his own handwriting 3 years before his illness, and explicitly stating his intention to provide for my security as his equal partner in marriage. This letter has been authenticated by forensic handwriting experts and legally validated by the probate court. I activated the audio system and began reading George's words aloud, letting his own voice speak through my careful recitation of his loving message and his explicit concerns about his daughter's attempts to manipulate him for financial gain. His words preserved in his careful handwriting revealed not only his love for me, but his fear that Lisa and Karen would try to steal from me if he died first. My beloved Patricia, I read in George's thoughtful cadence, I'm writing this letter because I'm worried about my health, and I want to make sure you're protected if something happens to me. Lisa and Karen have been asking too many questions about our finances lately, and I'm concerned they might try to pressure me into changing my will if I become sick. You've sacrificed everything for our family, and you deserve to be secure for the rest of your life. But Ellen had saved even more devastating evidence for the second phase of our presentation. She produced complete bank records and financial documentation that proved Lisa had stolen over $40,000 from George's accounts during his illness, along with medical testimony from his oncologist about the daughter's interference with his treatment decisions. These bank records, Ellen announced, with the authority of someone who'd spent decades building legal cases against people who exploited vulnerable populations, show systematic theft from George Coleman's accounts during the period when he was heavily medicated and legally incapable of making informed financial decisions. The dates of these unauthorized withdrawals correspond exactly with his chemotherapy treatments when he was experiencing documented cognitive impairment. Dr. Sarah Williams, George's oncologist, who'd treated him throughout his final illness, approached the podium to address Karen's lies about my care and his daughter's interference personally. "I treated George Coleman for 18 months, she said with obvious indignation at the character assassination she'd just witnessed. "And I can tell you that Patricia provided exemplary care while his daughters consistently interfered with his treatment and pressured him to make financial decisions when he was medically incapable of understanding the consequences." Margaret Foster, the Garden Alliance director and a respected community leader for 20 years, provided even more damaging testimony about Karen's harassment tactics and her family's systematic exploitation of elderly residents. Karen Thompson and her sister have been systematically targeting elderly community members who've accessed legal services for inheritance protection, she announced to the assembled crowd. They use intimidation, character assassination, and social media harassment to discourage elderly victims from pursuing legal remedies when their families are stealing from them. But the most devastating blow came when Ellen presented Karen's own social media history, including posts she'd deleted, but that had been preserved through digital forensics and legal discovery processes. The evidence showed a clear pattern of harassment threats and obvious coordination with Lisa to destroy my reputation through manufactured scandals and false accusations. These social media posts and deleted content, Ellen announced, show Karen Thompson systematically threatening elderly residents who've sought legal help while simultaneously using her access to her father's medical information to intimidate healthcare providers who supported his wife's caregiving efforts. I stepped forward, then moving to the center of the room where Karen stood with her face growing paler by the moment, clearly realizing that her carefully planned attack had backfired in the most devastating way possible, and that her criminal harassment attempt had been broadcast live to her own social media followers. "Karen," I said, addressing her directly for the first time since her arrival, "you've just committed elder abuse, intimidation, and attempted witness harassment in front of law enforcement officials, city council members, and a room full of witnesses. You've also just broadcast evidence of your family's systematic theft from a dying man to your own social media followers, creating permanent documentation of your criminal behavior." The room was dead silent now, everyone's attention focused on this family drama that had become a masterclass in recognizing and prosecuting elder abuse and witness intimidation tactics. Several law enforcement officials were taking notes, obviously understanding that they were witnessing exactly the kind of criminal behavior their elder protection efforts were designed to prevent and prosecute. "You've just proven in front of this entire community that you're willing to intimidate elderly crime victims, fabricate evidence, and use social media harassment to protect criminals from the consequences of their actions." I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You've demonstrated exactly why elderly residents need legal protection from family members who see them as obstacles to their inheritance schemes rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect." The transformation in the room's perception was immediate and absolute. Faces that had shown doubt and suspicion now reflected disgust and outrage directed entirely at Karen. People began standing and moving away from her as if her criminal behavior might be contagious, isolating her in an expanding circle of social condemnation and legal accountability. But the final blow came from an unexpected source that Karen couldn't have anticipated. Detective Michael Chen from the county's Elder Abuse Task Force stood up from his seat in the middle of the auditorium to address Karen's criminal behavior directly. "Ms. Thompson," he announced, with the authority of someone who'd spent years prosecuting exactly this kind of case. "Based on what we've just witnessed and the evidence presented, you're under investigation for elder abuse, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud an elderly person. I'll need you to come with me for questioning." The handcuffs weren't visible, but Karen's panicked retreat toward the exit created a scene that her own social media followers were witnessing in real time. Her phone, still recording her own humiliation, captured the moment when her intimidation campaign transformed into criminal investigation that would follow her for the rest of her life. As law enforcement officers approached Karen near the exit, her social media followers were witnessing the consequences of attempting to intimidate elderly crime victims in front of community leaders and law enforcement officials. The viral nature of her attack had become the viral documentation of her own criminal exposure and legal consequences. Several community members approached me with apologies for doubting my character and requests for information about accessing legal help for their own family financial disputes. The newspaper reporter was taking detailed notes about what appeared to be a major scandal involving systematic elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The applause that followed Karen's departure was spontaneous and overwhelming. But more than that, it felt like vindication, not just for me, but for every elderly person who'd ever been intimidated into silence by family members who used fear and harassment to cover up their criminal exploitation of vulnerable relatives. As I looked out at the room full of people who now understood exactly what we were fighting against, I felt a sense of justice so complete it was almost overwhelming. The retired florist who'd spent her career creating beauty for others had just delivered the most important presentation of her lifetime, one that had exposed criminals and protected other vulnerable elderly residents from similar exploitation. 5 months had passed since Karen's public humiliation and the criminal investigation that had exposed their family's systematic theft from George during his final illness, 5 months during which my life had settled into a rhythm of meaningful work and genuine community connections that felt like discovering myself for the first time in decades. The probate court had officially validated George's letter and restored my inheritance rights, while Lisa and Karen faced criminal charges for elder financial abuse and conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable person. I was working in my restored garden on a peaceful Saturday afternoon in late April, planting the memorial roses that community members had donated to honor elderly residents who'd survived family financial abuse, when I heard the sound of slow, hesitant footsteps on the gravel path that led to my front gate. Looking up from my work, I saw a figure approaching that took me several moments to recognize as the woman who'd once held such devastating power over my emotions and financial security. Lisa stood at my garden gate, looking like a ghost of her former self. Her once confident posture collapsed into the hunched shoulders of someone who'd lost everything that had once defined her identity and social status. Her expensive clothing had been replaced by discount store basics that had seen better days, her carefully maintained appearance now reflecting the kind of neglect that comes from someone who's stopped caring about how the world perceives her. She stood there for several minutes, clearly gathering courage for whatever performance she'd come to deliver, watching me work in my garden with an expression that might have been genuine longing if I'd been naive enough to believe she was capable of such authentic emotion. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the broken quality of someone who'd spent months practicing this moment while her world crumbled around her. "Patricia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the small space between us. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I know I don't have any right to ask for your time or your attention after everything I've done to hurt you and destroy our family. But I'm hoping you might give me just a few minutes to try to explain, to apologize, to somehow begin making amends for the terrible mistakes I've made." I continued working with my memorial roses, not acknowledging her presence beyond the slight tightening around my eyes that anyone who knew me well would recognize as barely contained irritation mixed with profound sadness for what we'd lost. She'd forfeited the right to call me by name the day she'd chosen manipulation over 12 years of step-maternal love, and no amount of tears or pleading would restore that precious privilege. But Lisa was nothing if not persistent, and she began the performance I'd been expecting for months. She approached my garden gate without invitation, her movements reflecting the kind of theatrical humility designed to evoke sympathy from anyone who might be watching our interaction from neighboring houses. "I've lost everything, Patricia." She sobbed her words, punctuated by what appeared to be genuine tears streaming down her face. "The criminal charges destroyed my job and my professional reputation. Karen won't speak to me because she blames me for getting her involved in the legal mess. The probate court ruled against us, and now I'm facing restitution payments that will bankrupt me. I have nowhere else to turn, and I'm hoping you might find it in your heart to forgive me." The psychological manipulation was as obvious as it was pathetic, an attempt to transform herself from perpetrator to victim by claiming that her criminal behavior was actually the result of circumstances beyond her control rather than her own fundamental character flaws and choices. She painted a picture of a woman who'd been led astray by legal advisors, who'd made terrible decisions because she'd been desperate to honor her mother's memory, who'd acted out of misguided family loyalty rather than simple greed and entitlement. I realize now that Karen influenced me in ways I didn't understand at the time. She continued, her voice taking on the wheedling quality of someone who'd convinced herself that her lies were actually truth. "She convinced me that you were taking advantage of Dad's illness, that we needed to protect his legacy from someone who didn't really understand our family's history and values. I should have trusted my own instincts instead of listening to her paranoid theories about your motivations." But even as she delivered these manufactured excuses with apparent sincerity, her true motivation began to emerge like a snake shedding its skin. "I've been thinking about how we might move forward together," she said, her voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone proposing a business arrangement rather than seeking genuine reconciliation. "Maybe there's a way we could help each other through these difficult times. You've done so well with your community work, and I could contribute to that. I could help you expand your programs, maybe even use my legal knowledge to help other families avoid the mistakes we made." The request for money came disguised as an offer of partnership, wrapped in language about family reconciliation and shared purpose, but its true nature was as transparent as glass. Lisa was offering to help me continue the very community work that had exposed her crimes and led to her prosecution, apparently believing I was stupid enough to fall for such an obvious manipulation attempt. "If you could see your way to helping me get back on my feet financially," she said, dropping the pretense entirely as her desperation overwhelmed her calculated approach. "I could start over somewhere else. Maybe even go back to school and get training for a career that doesn't involve legal work. We could be a real family again, Patricia. We could put all this pain and legal trouble behind us and rebuild what we lost when Dad got sick. As I knelt there in my memorial garden, listening to her attempt to monetize her own criminal conviction, while simultaneously asking me to finance her escape from the consequences of her actions, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day I'd walked out of my stolen home with evidence of George's true intentions in my possession. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no step-maternal instinct to comfort someone who was obviously suffering from the results of her own criminal choices. Lisa had become a complete stranger to me, someone whose pain and desperation were no more relevant to my life than the troubles of any other criminal I might read about in the newspaper. The emotional connection that had once bound us together had been severed by her own actions, cut away piece by piece through months of systematic abuse and betrayal of her dying father. Lisa, I said finally, looking up from my gardening to meet her eyes with the kind of detached curiosity one might reserve for studying an interesting but ultimately irrelevant specimen. You broke our family when you chose to manipulate your dying father instead of loving him. You destroyed 12 years of trust when you decided that stealing from me was more important than honoring the woman who'd helped raise you. Find your own path forward because it doesn't include me. I stood up slowly, brushing soil from my gardening gloves with the same casual efficiency I'd once used to dismiss difficult customers who tried to cheat me or damage my business reputation. Ellen has already prepared legal documents that prohibit you from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest and additional criminal charges that will make your current legal problems seem insignificant by comparison. Lisa's face cycled through disbelief rage and finally a kind of desperate panic as she realized that her final attempt at manipulation had not only failed, but had actually resulted in additional legal restrictions on her behavior. You can't throw away 12 years of being family, she whispered, her voice breaking with what might have been genuine despair. Stepmothers are supposed to forgive their children, support them through difficult times. I'm still the daughter you helped raise, no matter what mistakes I've made. But I was already walking toward my house, leaving her standing at my garden gate like the trespasser she'd become. As if summoned by our conversation, Ellen appeared at my front door with legal papers already prepared for exactly this moment. Ms. Thompson, she said with professional authority, approaching Lisa with the measured confidence of someone who dealt with many desperate criminals in her long career, you're being served with a restraining order that prohibits you from approaching Mrs. Coleman or her property. Any violation will result in your immediate arrest and additional charges for harassment and violation of court orders. The papers fell from Lisa's nerveless hands as she stared at me with the expression of someone watching their last hope disappear forever. Patricia, please, she whispered one final time. Don't let it end like this between us. But I was already closing my front door, shutting out her voice and her presence with the same finality I'd once used to end relationships with suppliers who tried to cheat me or customers who refused to pay their bills. You ended it the day you chose to destroy your father's final wishes, I said through the closing gap. Now live with the consequences. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in years, broken only by the distant sound of Lisa's footsteps retreating down my driveway and Ellen's satisfied voice as she confirmed that the restraining order would be enforced by local law enforcement and monitored through the criminal court system. As I returned to my memorial garden and my rose planting, I felt a profound sense of completion settle over me, like warm sunshine on a perfect spring day. The last vestige of my old life, the final attempt at manipulation from someone who'd never understood my worth, had been dealt with permanently and decisively. As I sit in my restored garden this evening, surrounded by the memorial roses that bloom in honor of elderly residents who survived family financial abuse, I can barely recognize the broken woman who discovered her stolen inheritance 8 months ago and felt like her entire world was collapsing around her. My days now overflow with meaningful work that feeds my soul in ways I never experienced during my years of unappreciated sacrifice and one-sided devotion to ungrateful stepchildren. 4 mornings a week, I coordinate our expanded Gardens of Resilience program, helping other communities establish therapeutic spaces for elderly residents recovering from family trauma. 3 afternoons each week, I facilitate our memoir writing workshop, where survivors share their stories and find their voices through the healing power of bearing witness to both love and betrayal. The garden where Lisa made her final pathetic plea for money and forgiveness has become a sanctuary that attracts visitors from across the region, people who find hope in the beauty that can emerge from the ashes of destroyed relationships. Each rose represents not just survival, but transformation, the kind of growth that's only possible when you stop defining yourself through other people's love and start nurturing your own inner light. My home reflects the woman I've become rather than the person I thought I was supposed to be for other people's benefit. The walls are covered with letters from elderly residents. I've helped protect their assets from family theft photographs, from our writing workshops, and artwork created by community members who found their strength through our support programs. I've learned that I am infinitely stronger than I ever imagined possible, that the woman who'd spent 12 years trying to earn Lisa's love was more than capable of protecting herself and others from exploitation and abuse. I no longer define myself by other people's approval or measure my worth by their gratitude or affection. The validation I need comes from within, from the knowledge that I've survived the worst kind of family betrayal and emerged with my integrity intact and my capacity for authentic relationships restored to appropriate boundaries. The philosophical lesson that emerged from my journey through devastating betrayal and back to authentic happiness is both simple and profound. Betrayal cuts deep, slicing through the very foundation of trust and love that makes human connection possible and meaningful. But those wounds also reveal reserves of strength and resilience. You never knew you possessed inner resources that lie dormant until circumstances demand their emergence. You must guard your heart carefully, learning to distinguish between those who truly value your worth and those who view you merely as a resource to be exploited until depleted. But most importantly, you must never stop nurturing your own inner light, your own value, your own right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who chooses to walk away from your life when you establish appropriate boundaries. Peace comes not from others' approval or gratitude or even their love, though authentic relationships can enrich your existence immeasurably. True tranquility emerges from standing firm in your own worth, from building a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations, from refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your spirit or exploits your generous nature. As I tend my memorial roses each morning, deadheading spent blooms and nurturing new growth, I often wonder how many other people might discover their own hidden strength if they could see themselves through eyes unclouded by others' manipulation and cruelty. My garden thrives in defiant beauty despite the harsh seasons it has survived, and so do I. In the end, That may be the most profound victory of all.